Hi, I'm Mark Osborn, a senior researcher with the Secureworks Counter Threat Unit, or CTU. I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes with you now to set the scene before our presentation today, and I'll be here again at the end of the talk to answer any questions that you might have. The CTU is our home for all things research related, so this is where we build the detection logic that goes into our Taegis platform and where we track all the major threats that you might face. So we're looking at things like cybercrime, nation-state threats, hacktivists, and even insiders. The first two of those are the most likely to affect you, so those are the priorities for us. We spend a lot of our time tracking the criminal networks and nation-state threats that might affect your business. The criminal element is obviously financially focused, and they'll be looking to monetize access to your data, either by selling it to someone else or by holding it ransom and demanding payment from you for decryption keys or to prevent dumping of your data online. State-sponsored threats is basically just traditional espionage that has moved online, and that could be national security driven, or it could just be for economic advantage. The CTU has a number of inputs and outputs, and on both sides of this equation, some of these are machine generated and others are actually looked after by real human beings. Data is the lifeblood of all the activity within the CTU, and we gather it from a number of sources. This includes things like incident response engagements, malware collection feeds, dark web monitoring, and our own botnet emulation frameworks. There's also a host of third-party data that we pull in as well via various relationships and data feeds. We ingest all of that together with open source data and extract all the indicators and data that we can use. But at this point, of course, it's just data. It's just a raw material. We need to analyze and process and turn this into something more useful or intelligence. Once that important work is done, then we've got something that can turned into an output. The outputs, again, might be technical, such as indicator feeds and countermeasures that should be enriched in the platform, or they could just be things for humans to consume. So threat briefings, threat intelligence reporting, marketing materials, that kind of thing. All those things that provide the narrative and context for the vast amount of data that's actually hidden behind the scenes. Okay, well, that's probably enough from me. You're about to watch a presentation about the threat from China. This is a presentation I originally gave to our Global Threat Intelligence Summit a few weeks ago. The content, however, is not time sensitive, and what you see here will be relevant for many months to come. It's basically about fundamentally understanding what drives the China-based threat groups to target organizations for data theft. As I said again, I'll be here afterwards to pick up this discussion and answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Hi everyone, hi, I'm Mark from the research team. As Julia said, we'll talk a little bit about malware and geopolitics, so hopefully a bit of something here for everyone. This talk is the A to Z of dominance, re-examining Chinese cyber threats in the age of the Xictionary. I know immediately many of you will now be thinking the age of the what, but no, this is not just some gimmick that I made up for a talk, it's a real thing. Xi Jinping is literally redefining the terms in which China is described. This is terminology that's being used by Xinhua, China's official state news agency. It's the same with the daily newspapers in China, the TV stations, and the various social media feeds put out by the Chinese state. It's literally everywhere. So, the age of the Xictionary. Just a quick detour at this point. I wanted to show this map to you for a couple of reasons. This shows the geographic spread of victim systems with a PlugX malware infection as captured by a sinkhole that we operated for a while earlier this year. This is just a snapshot summary of millions of connections that we received into the sinkhole. Each one of these blobs you see is a location with compromised computers that think they're calling out to a command and control server, instead of which they connected to us. As you can see, there are infected systems all over the world. There's also a notable detail on this map. And for many years now, I've been hearing about a supposed apocalyptic event known as the Cyber Pearl Harbor. Well, I have news, people. It's already here, and the sinkhole revealed it. But joking aside, remember this map. We'll be coming back to it later. So, back to Xi Jinping. In September 2017, the Chinese Communist Party Central Committee decided that Xi's political philosophies, generally referred to as Xi Jinping thought, would become part of the party constitution. This has also since become a component of the educational curriculum too, And at the same time, China removed the two-term limit for presidents, effectively giving Xi a term of office with no end, making one man very happy. Now, in most countries that aren't ruled by totalitarian state apparatus, we usually think of the government of a country as being at the top. It's the government that decides on economic and political strategy, creates laws, and so on. However, it's worth pointing out that in China, it's the party that rules. The Chinese Communist Party is at the top of the tree, and the government serves the party. So looking here, we see Li Qiang on the right, and he leads the government or the state council. The man at the top is no surprise. In March last year, Xi was awarded his third 5-year term as president. It was a bit of a foregone conclusion, as Xi had sidelined potential rivals and fills the top ranks of the party with his own supporters since taking power in 2012. Nevertheless, it's a democratic process, and you may like to know that the vote for Xi at the National People's Congress was 2,952 to 0. So Xi is president of the PRC, the General Secretary of the Central Committee, and chairman of the Central Military Commission, which is the body that runs the PLA. The armed forces, that is the PLA, are the armed wing of the party, not the government. So, moving along, adding to the previous diagram, we can now see how the military and intelligence agencies fit into the picture. The PLA structures on the left report to the CMC, and MSS structures on the right reporting to the State Council. But reality is always a bit blurry, and there are dotted line relationships all over the place. One of the more notable links is between the MSS and the United Front Workers' Department. The United Front is a party bureau without an obvious remit, but it kind of works like this. They reach out to all levels of Chinese society, home and abroad, that aren't already in some way participating in the party machinery. And then they ensure that everyone is working towards party goals, or at least not against them. This involves a lot of community building and social organising work, and it's often seen as a force for good. I think of these guys as like a Marxist-Leninist Freemasons. They can provide a path to representation, success, prosperity, but your continued prosperity will be dependent upon your obedience to the party. The United Front are also known to work with the MSS, as well as running their own intelligence operations. They're often associated with foreign influence ops, harassment of dissidents, and election interference. We recently saw cases of Christine Fang in the US and Christine Lee in the UK, both women alleged to be working for the United Front on long-term political influence campaigns, and extremely well connected, even at the highest levels of government. In 2015, the 7 military regions of the PLA became the 5 theatre commands, and the old technical reconnaissance bureaus were absorbed into a new structure known as the Strategic Support Force. This seemed like quite a big deal at the time, but they've just reorganised again, and the old Strategic Support Force has now gone, replaced by a cyberspace force and an information support force, both newly created this year. So reform continues, and perhaps the SSF was always going to be a temporary structure anyway. What's happened, practically speaking, is that the PLA structure has flattened again, and the ISF and CSF come directly under Central Military Commission control. This gives the CMC better flexibility with provision of resources, particularly when creating joint forces for active duty. Some commentators that I've read suggest this may be something they've learned from observing US military structures. The CMC becomes more of a focal point, if you will, and remember who is running the CMC. So we've spoken a bit about how the PLA is organised, how it's reforming and the structures there, but what of the MSS? The MSS was for many years quite opaque to those of us in the West trying to follow the various threat group activities. In the early 2000s, the PLA was much noisier, much more prolific, and consequently much easier to follow. But several things changed that. Security vendors were publishing reports that called out China, network defenders were getting better, and those early smash and grab tactics no longer worked. Then came the Obama-Xi summit in 2015, and subsequently China's new national security law in 2017, both of which have contributed to a swing away from PLA and more towards MSS as being the natural home of cyber operations. But the organisation of MSS threat groups has remained hard to unravel, with a few notable exceptions. The MSS carries out most of its intel collection via a network of contractors and front companies run out of its regional state security bureaus. A great example of how the MSS works was revealed in the 2018 indictment of Yangjun Zhu. Yangjun was Deputy Division Director with the MSS's Jiangsu State Security Department. He was arrested in Belgium on April 1st, 2018 and extradited to the US. The indictment documents released at this time, together with our existing knowledge of the Bronze Express threat group, painted a fascinating picture that reveals a lot about MSS operations. We saw a combination of cyber operations, insider threat, and traditional human intelligence all working together, and all facilitated by this single MSS intelligence officer. He was using government and university connections, along with his MSS front companies, to mask his real intent, obtaining vital engineering data from US aerospace companies. We've seen other similar examples. However, something else happened earlier this year that reveals much of MSS Intel Collect to be even more convoluted and messy. On 16th February this year, a GitHub repo appeared containing a data dump from Chinese security company iSoon, uploaded to the site by an unknown source. Some called this China's Snowden moment. This includes chat logs, product marketing materials, white papers, screenshots of demo products, and also examples of types of data stolen, clearly showing the companies involved in surveillance and intelligence collection. They even self-described their teams as being APTs. Since that time, the data has been removed, but what was there tells us such a lot about how the various MSS front companies and contractors are working. Looking at some of the chat logs between company leaders, we see them talking about intel collect they've got, what they think they can sell, and so on. It's particularly interesting and it helps to inform the way that we can see they work, showing that the company will hack victims speculatively for data they think they can sell, as well as perhaps just fulfilling specific customer requests. We also learned of a court case scheduled for October 2023, where the plaintiff, Chengdu 404, was suing the iSoon company in a software contract dispute. Chengdu 404, some of you might remember, are a company already identified as APT 41, Bronze Atlas, and several members of which are already subject to US indictments. Okay, time to look at some threat group activity from earlier this year. Here we see a supposedly secret document that appears to have been authored by the senior military assistant to the Philippines Secretary of National Defense. The document refers to an incident at the Vietnamese embassy in Hanoi and also talks about proposed military patrols in the South China Sea. The US and Philippines military had indeed conducted joint patrols, and at the time, Chinese defense officials responded very publicly, urging the US to immediately stop meddling in the South China Sea issue. This document was in fact a malicious fake, built with a variant of the infamous Royal Road Maldoc builder. It drops a downloader executable to the victim's temp folder, which then subsequently calls out to a C2 for a follow-on payload. The downloader used a specific mutex value when executed that enabled us to link it with another malicious sample also targeted at Philippine military personnel. This second sample uses a file name that included a reference to a meeting with Colonel Peter Rowell of the US Army, and a quick search online reveals that the Colonel had indeed visited with Philippine colleagues at the end of 2023. Also, this past 12 months, we've seen China-based threat groups targeting the semiconductor industry. Here we analysed a self-extracting archive that contained a trio of files for a DLL sideload, together with a decoy document. The decoy was copied from a Taiwanese energy-saving website. The file name translates to Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, and the content suggests that the intended targets were likely to be Chinese-speaking individuals working in the semiconductor industry. This malware decrypts and executes a Cobalt Strike payload contained within the bin.config file. The payload has the appearance of a normal executable, but it does have a shellcode header typical of Cobalt Strike stageless payload artifacts. We see this kind of style of payload a lot with China-based threat groups. In July of this year, we also looked at another Bronze President campaign that affected multiple countries. That included Taiwan, Japan, Vietnam, Kazakhstan, Serbia, Philippines, and Mongolia. Most of the observed malicious samples were all named meeting_invitation, and they used an Adobe PDF icon to entice users to open them. In fact, these were all malicious MSC files, which was a bit of a novelty. If opened, these are executed by the Microsoft Management Console, prompting the victim to click a link, which masquerades as either a PDF or Word document. Clicking that link executes a PowerShell command that downloads and executes another file, a malicious MSI, from a staging server. That then goes on to drop and execute 3 further files for a DLL sideload installing plugx onto the victim system. Again, we can see Bronze President's typical payload style with a shellcode file header. The file names, paths and payloads in this campaign all link back to previous Bronze President activity in 2023 that had targeted European MFAs as well as individuals involved with human rights work, using appropriate decoy files for each target, as you see here. In August of this year, we also looked at another Bronze President campaign using the TinyNote downloader, this time involved in attacks against Myanmar. The TinyNote sample was an executable file with the rather convoluted name Documents from Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan.exe, and we managed to link this TinyNote sample to an older one that was first uploaded to VirusTotal by a user in Latvia back in February 2023. Now, in early 23, we were also looking at Latvia, as at that time we'd seen Bronze President deploying a malware called MQ Shell in various attacks against European nations that did also include Latvia. The 2023 attacks used very similar file names to our TinyNote sample, and you can see some examples here, such as PDF passport and CVs of diplomatic members from Tokyo of Japan.exe, similarly convoluted with long file names with an exe. But my takeaway point here is that a lot of people watching this might think, hey, why do I care what malware some random threat actor deploys in Myanmar? But as shown, the answer is probably quite simple. Watch what happens in Myanmar today. It could be here tomorrow. And these guys will repeat their TTPs. So, a quick word about targeting, which on the whole is really very broad and quite difficult to explain in a succinct way. But I'll try. So, there are some obvious targets like Taiwan and all the Southeast Asian and South China Sea neighbours with their numerous land and sea territorial disputes. And then potentially military opponents will always be obvious targets. So that would be the Five Eyes plus India and Japan at a minimum. But I think probably the biggest driver by far is political and economic influence. China will bring to bear many different resources in their efforts to shape the world order as they desire. And using cyber-enabled Intel Collect can support many of those efforts. So this brings many industries into scope. Think manufacturing, construction, agriculture, utilities, education, healthcare, and many others. So think of China's business interests, and you quickly see that a lot of things can be influenced with the right information. Trade negotiations and tariffs, subsidies, legal and governance challenges, investment projects, infrastructure building and finance, all of these things can become intelligence collection targets. And that's before you even start thinking about specific industries that might be of particular interest. We spoke at another event recently about China's domination of rare earth metals, an essential component for clean energy, medical applications, computing, and military hardware. China has positioned itself at the centre of global supply chains, completely dominating the market for rare earths, especially on the processing side. The rest of the world is literally decades behind and scrambling to catch up. Back in the 1980s, rare earth production was spread around many countries, but then along came China, with their state-owned enterprises, with their various subsidies, unencumbered with the need to make a profit or hampered with environmental regulation, and they pretty much wiped out the existing industry. They lowered prices to the point that no one could compete, put the competition out of business, then moved in and took over, eventually bringing prices back up again once they completely dominated the industry. A lot of Chinese trade and investment gravitates towards countries with resources that can be extracted and processed. For example, copper from Serbia and Peru, lithium from Chile, cobalt, iron ore, manganese, and various others from various sub-Saharan African countries. The list is virtually endless. And geographically speaking, China's appetite for natural resources aligns very nicely with its Belt and Road Initiative, which brings us all back to where we started. So if you remember the map with the Plug X victims, have another look. It's clear to see that actually there are compromised systems all over the world, and think to yourself, well, this is just one particular version of one particular piece of malware, this Plug X from Bronze President. This is probably just the tip of a very large iceberg. But it's interesting to see where the data clumps up, and there are clearly a lot of infections in West Africa, for example. So I thought I'd overlay a couple of other interesting things for you to have a look at. Here you see the main arteries of China's Belt and Road Initiative, and you can see that this makes quite a good match for the locations of Plug X compromise. There are also many smaller links that you don't see as well. For example, the blue line of maritime trade that joins onto East Africa lands in Kenya at Mombasa, and from there the route heads inland on the brand new Mombasa-Nairobi standard gauge railway, which is one of Xi Jinping's flagship African projects. And now here's the same map again, but this time we've overlaid the locations of some of China's biggest mining and mineral extraction investments. I'm not saying this is conclusive proof of anything, but I've been doing this for a long time. And China's cyber operations do have a tendency to follow wherever Chinese economic interest lies. So, to wrap up a very quick session there, pay attention to Xi Jinping. Pay attention to the party and the state media. The messages they deliver are coherent and very well crafted. Yes, there is always an element of propaganda and political gamesmanship, but they are clearly telling us the things that they care about. There are no surprises here. Economic success, military and political influence on the world stage, and all of this viewed through the lens of the party. New China TV and Xinhua are continuously pumping out messaging that has adopted the Xictionary as its point of reference. These news channels talk about things like the China-Africa community with a shared future in their slick, well-produced propaganda pieces. Their intention is clear. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. So I'm back again, and I hope you enjoyed listening to that presentation. As I said, that was something that I first delivered a few weeks ago, but as you can now see, the context and the background there is all material that isn't going to change anytime soon. So I hope that gave you some food for thought and explained some of the reasons why we see the actions that we do see from China-based threat groups that have been stealing economic property, intellectual property for many years. I'm just looking through some of the questions that have come in, and let's get to one or two of these. So Ben asked, if your organization is operating in China, what would be the top recommendations to keep your data secure? Ben, that I have to say is the most difficult challenge. Basically, if you're operating in country in China, all bets are off because your comms will be going over the infrastructure that's owned by the state, and undoubtedly you will be employing a lot of local staff to maintain your building or provide facilities, that kind of thing. So as you know, apart from all the normal challenges you would have trying to protect IT infrastructure, you also have a couple of almost insurmountable problems that are going on at the same time. So you have to figure out what your crown jewels are and where they are, and have some really good logging around those. That would be my top recommendations. But yeah, as an organization, you need to take a very long, hard look at what you have in China and how you protect it. Frank asked me why there is not a red dot on the map on Cuba when the Chinese Communist Party has several spy stations there. That's amusing. No one's asked me that before, Frank. I guess a couple of reasons. One is that's just a snapshot on that map there of a particular malware family. So it's literally just like a photo of one particular day or a short time period anyway. But then of course we may not expect to see PlugX beaconing into a sinkhole infrastructure from the location that's kind of owned by the Chinese, if you will. We're more likely to see it from the places where you would expect and hope to see victim machines. So you're typically thinking of Western Europe and North America, and also those locations in West Africa that we picked out there as well. What else have we got? So what steps should I take to detect these types of Chinese threats? That's a big one. Let's see where we can start. I'd say start with your perimeter devices. So it's a funny thing in a way. When I started in IT doing security, it was the early 2000s, and the perimeter was a big deal. In fact, security was pretty much all about antivirus and firewalls, and that was it. And firewalls were king. The security of most organizations was rooted in the firewall admin. And then for a long time that went away. So we've been kind of conditioned to be thinking that the perimeter's gone away. Organizations don't have a perimeter anymore. But actually they do, and it's really, really important. The perimeter is perhaps not quite the same thing it used to be, but we've all got services and servers at the edge of our network, whether that's in a cloud or whether it's at a physical location. And we've got switches and routers, we've got VPN concentrators, Exchange servers, Citrix, all these kind of things providing remote access to our employees, as well as routing data and providing services for customers, suppliers, and other people we might need to be connected with. So these perimeter devices are actually becoming the favorite playground of a lot of Chinese threat groups now. This is the kind of the attack surface that you need to be looking after, and keeping these things up to date, keeping them monitored, and doing as much logging as you can. So these are the kind of things that aren't often maintained as well as a Windows infrastructure, because it's just not as easy to maintain these things. And so often VPN devices, for example, are quite neglected. They might be running out of date software and they remain vulnerable. So those things do need to be looked at carefully. Internally, it's really all about the various different tripwires that you can put in place. So there's a lot you can do. There's a lot of different things to check. But I would say that an EDR agent or similar is going to help you on top of your regular antivirus. I think a lot of advanced actors in your network, if they're there, they will look just like regular users. So they'll be living off the land. They'll be using your user accounts. They'll be using the command line tools and utilities that are built into your operating systems. So it's difficult to spot them. There's quite often no malware involved in an advanced intrusion. And that means that your business process and systems you have maybe for detecting rogue users will come into play. So if you can spot anomalous behavior, then that's the kind of thing that might key you into the fact you've got an advanced intrusion going on, rather than just a regular user account doing something slightly odd. So yeah, there's a few things there to think about, but obviously that's a big question. What else do we have? Are there any special controls or technologies needed to defend my organization from Chinese threats? Well, I'd say if you're a valuable target, maybe if you're in defense supply chain or something like that, then maybe yes. And there could be some specific controls that you might want to think about in terms of how you protect your crown jewels, whatever they are, probably your intellectual property. But for most organizations, probably not. You just need to start with the basics and do the basic things really, really well. So it's all the things that you've heard 1,000 times over about keeping software patched and keeping devices up to date. Logging everything you can for as long as you can is really important. And I quite often say to people, think about the things that you need to do to protect yourself from ransomware. So this is the threat which is the one that's most likely to impact you, whatever industry vertical you're in. And it's also your biggest impact threat. So if you get ransomware come into your organization, you're going to know about it. That's going to be a really bad day. And that's the day you don't want to be running your IT infrastructure. So do the things you would do to protect from ransomware and do all of those really, really well. I think it's rare for nation state actors to burn their high value zero-day exploits on what I might call run-of-the-mill targets. So there's a lot of organizations that come into the bailiwick of Chinese cyber threat just because of where you might be operating and the customers you might have and the information you might have access to, but you're not necessarily what I might call high value. And they'll use the same methods to break into your network that a ransomware operator might use. So they'll look for the weak link in your chain. They'll look for easy ways in, and that will be perimeter devices not patched, or it will be exploitable users who might download a zip archive, unpack it, and run the content for them. So, that's the kind of thing to protect against. What else have I got here? What do you see changing in the next 12 months? Anything special to watch out for? That's a nice one. It's the time of year also when those of us in research are often asked to produce things like our predictions for the next year. Secureworks, like many other vendors, like to produce the kind of reports that says this is what we think is going to change, this is what we think might happen. We're no exception. I think we've put one out recently, or it's due out soon. But it's that kind of question. In many ways, I would say not much change. It's particularly if you're talking about China threat. It's the long game that China's playing. Their objectives won't change much over the course of a year, which is fairly short term, really. Of course, there will be interesting events that happen during that year. There'll be new vulnerabilities discovered. There might be media-worthy news stories connected to vulnerabilities or, high prominent maybe compromises that get reported in the media. So there'll be some interesting landscape along the way. But on the whole, I would say nothing much is going to change. I think if you look at the end of next year at what happened, you'll say, yep, could probably have predicted most of that. Not a lot of surprises. Let me just have another quick check. I think I've got one more question that I can see. I'm just to refresh the view on my questions. They come in slowly, and I have to keep refreshing to see what's there. Lawrence Martin, public-private partnership organisation warns on domestic affairs from Chinese nationals. What do we see? I'm not quite sure what the context of that question is. That's difficult to answer. Maybe we can, if that is something of importance, we can follow that up afterwards. Somebody else has asked me, are they building IT infrastructure in Africa or forming relationships with these countries to build out their IT infrastructure? That's interesting. There is a little bit of both, but it's actually not uncommon for China to provide a lot of the infrastructure that goes around their Belt and Road Initiative projects. So if, for example, they're building a port or a railroad in East Africa, which is something we mentioned there in the talk. Yes, indeed, they will be also providing IT infrastructure. That could be hardware and switching equipment that goes into ground, into old-fashioned telecoms exchanges, that kind of thing. Or it could be satellite infrastructure as well, because quite often it's hard to put things into the ground in Africa. But they will also be providing all the infrastructure that goes around road and rail as well. And more often than not, they'll be shipping in their own staff to do all that as well. So they quite often don't even employ local staff. Right, I'm getting a nod that we're out of time. There are one or two other questions I didn't get to. If anybody has anything urgent or anything they really wanted to follow up with, then I'm sure we can find some way to do that. And we'll get back to you after the presentation finishes. But with that, I'd like to thank everyone for attending. I hope you found it useful, and perhaps we'll see you again on another event very soon. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.